It began as nothing more than a wedding portrait. Or at least, that was what it pretended to be. History has a way of hiding its darkest whispers in the stillness of old photographs, and on that quiet afternoon inside the tall-windowed Atlanta Historical Archive, Dr. Rebecca Morrison stumbled upon one of those whispers. Soft sunlight drifted across her desk as she examined a collection of early 20th century photographs donated by an anonymous estate. Among the faded portraits and rigid formal gatherings, one image made her pause, made the air around her feel heavier. A wedding photograph, dated 1903. A white man, rigid in a dark three-piece suit. A black woman, seated beside him dressed in an elaborate white gown that shimmered even through the age-worn print. Their hands were clasped between them, a gesture that should have symbolized unity. Yet something about it felt terribly unmistakably wrong. 15 years as an archivist had trained Rebecca to recognize anomalies, and this photograph radiated wrongness, the kind that lingers behind your eyes long after you look away. In 1903, Georgia interracial marriage wasn't simply taboo. It was illegal, a crime, an offense punishable by imprisonment under laws dating back to 1750. And yet, here it was. She marked the image for high-resolution scanning, though the uneasy feeling coiled in her stomach refused to fade. 2 weeks later, reviewing the digital files late in the afternoon, Rebecca zoomed methodically through the photograph, studying the painted studio backdrop, the gleam of the woman's jewelry, the tight-lipped stiffness of the man's expression. Then she returned to their intertwined hands. She zoomed in, and then, again, her breath caught the bride's fingers. They weren't resting at all. They were speaking. A subtle distress signal, her thumb and index finger forming a small hidden plea for help concealed in plain sight within a pose meant to mimic matrimonial affection. A silent cry, frozen for 120 years, waiting for anyone to finally listen. Shaking Rebecca forwarded the scan to Dr. Marcus Williams, a specialist in African American history and Jim Crow-era records. When he arrived that evening, she simply handed him the photograph. He studied it, his expression darkening like a storm pulling across the horizon. "This shouldn't exist," he murmured. Georgia's anti-miscegenation laws made this impossible in 1903. Unless what Rebecca whispered, though dread, already prickled beneath her skin. Marcus leaned back slowly. Unless this wasn't a marriage at all. Unless this picture documents something else, coercion, captivity. Or worse. Look at her face. That isn't a bride. That's terror barely contained. They pored over every detail. The studio stamp read, Morrison and Wright. Portrait Studio, Atlanta, Georgia. August 1903. On the back, a faint notation, Mr. Charles Whitfield and servant. Not wife, not bride, servant. The word hung in the air like a curse. He didn't even try to hide it, Marcus said softly. This photograph wasn't meant to commemorate a marriage. It was meant to record ownership. Rebecca felt the nausea rise. But why the wedding gown? Why stage it like this? Marcus searched through old records, his voice dropping into something hollow. Control. Humiliation. Some white men of the period created these grotesque parodies of marriage rituals without legality, intimacy, without consent. A display of power wrapped in the costume of romance. That night, Rebecca barely slept. She saw the woman's eyes each time she blinked, her trembling fingers, her silent plea. Who was she? What happened to her? Did anyone in her own time notice the signal she risked everything to show? Or had her message stayed hidden for over a century, reaching out only now? Far, far too late. The next morning, Rebecca and Marcus went to the Georgia State Archives. Their only clue was the man's name, Charles Whitfield. The archivist on duty, Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, an elderly black woman who had worked there for 35 years, stiffened when she heard it. Charles Whitfield, she repeated slowly. That name still casts a shadow in certain families, and not one anyone would be proud of. She disappeared into the records room. When she returned, she carried several boxes that seemed to darken the room simply by being placed upon the table. The Whitfield name drifted through Atlanta's history like a shadow, prominent, powerful, and rarely questioned. From the 1870s through the 1920s, the family flourished, building their fortune on cotton and textiles in the years after the war. When Charles Whitfield inherited the business in 1898, he stepped into wealth already deeply rooted in the city's social fabric. The 1900 census painted a chilling, quiet picture. Charles, 28 years old, residing in a grand house on Peachtree Street, surrounded not by family, but by servants. All black, all women and girls, ages 14 to 30. As Rebecca scanned the list, her heartbeat quickened. One entry stood out: Louisa, age 16, domestic servant, literate. Marcus uncovered property records next. Whitfield owned several buildings across Atlanta, including a textile factory staffed almost entirely by black women and children. They worked long hours in brutal conditions for pay so low, it barely sustained life. And yet newspapers of the time praised him as a progressive employer, a pillar of the community. Rebecca felt her stomach twist at the contrast between the public myth and the private reality forming in front of them. They turned their attention to identifying the woman in the photograph. Her anonymity, labeled merely as servant, was an obstacle, but Mrs. Hayes offered a path forward. If the portrait was taken in August 1903, she said softly, look for missing persons or unusual reports around that time. Families tried to report things even when the police chose not to listen. 2 painstaking days later, Marcus found it a brief dismissive police report from September 1903. Report filed by Henry and Martha Johnson regarding daughter Louisa Johnson, age 19, employed in the household of Charles Whitfield. Not seen in over a month. Mr. Whitfield states she is well and fulfilling her contracted duties. No evidence of wrongdoing. Case closed. Rebecca cross-referenced the name. There she was again, Louisa Johnson, 16 years old in the 1900 census, living with her parents and 3 younger siblings near Auburn Avenue. A family of readers, a family that owned their modest home, a family pushing upward despite the crushing weight of Jim Crow. Marcus found more. In 1902, Louisa's father Henry suffered a construction accident and could no longer work. Debt followed like a slow-moving storm. A church charity record showed the family appealing for help in early 1903. This is how it happened, Marcus murmured, grief and anger blending in his voice. Whitfield saw a family in crisis, a girl with limited choices. He offered work, maybe promised stability, and then Rebecca found the letter that completed the picture. Written by Louisa's mother Martha to their pastor in July 1903. We have not seen our Louisa in 3 weeks. Mr. Whitfield says she is well, but he will not let us visit. She usually writes every week, but we have received no letters. When I went to the house, the servants avoided my eyes. Reverend, something is wrong. Please help us. The pastor's journal offered his response, spoke with Mr. Whitfield. He assures me she is content and simply busy. Expressed annoyance at the family's doubts. I believe him. The Johnsons must trust in God's plan and avoid troubling a gentleman who has shown them charity. Rebecca's hands trembled as she read. Charity. That word again used to excuse anything. Still searching for answers, Rebecca tracked down the records of Morrison and Wright Portrait Studio. To her astonishment, some documents had survived through the descendants of its founder. She contacted James Morrison, great-grandson of photographer William Morrison. He invited them to his home in Decatur, where he preserved a meticulous family archive. My great-grandfather photographed Atlanta society for 15 years. James explained, guiding them into a quiet study. He kept journals, honest ones. He struggled with what he saw. He retrieved a worn leather book and opened to a page marked by a faded ribbon. August 17, 1903. Today I performed perhaps the most disturbing task of my career. Mr. Charles Whitfield requested a wedding portrait. But there was no wedding. The young Negro woman he brought was not there willingly. Her gown was expensive, yet ill-fitting. And her eyes held such fear I nearly refused. Rebecca leaned closer as James continued reading. Whitfield insisted on posing them as husband and wife, hands joined. When he seized her hand, she trembled. I saw bruises on her wrists. As I positioned her for the camera, she looked directly at me. Silent desperation. While preparing the exposure, I noticed her fingers shift, forming a deliberate gesture. A signal. I said nothing but captured it clearly. 3 exposures were taken. Whitfield demanded perfection. When they left, I felt ill. I knew this was not a wedding. It was evidence of a crime. But who would believe me? The authorities would mock the idea that a man like Whitfield could ever do wrong. Marcus expanded the investigation, digging into Whitfield's history. What emerged was not a single event, but a pattern. Years of exploitation spread across the city like roots burrowing into dark soil. Between 1899 and 1905, at least 6 families filed complaints about daughters who went to work for Whitfield and then vanished from contact. Each case followed the same grim rhythm. A struggling family, a young woman often no older than 20. Letters home that stopped suddenly. Visits declined. Police dismissing any concerns. 2 of the young women eventually returned months later, hollow-eyed and refusing to speak of what had happened. Rebecca found a rare account from a woman named Sarah who had worked for Whitfield in 1901. Her testimony, preserved only because a black community organization bothered to record it, revealed the truth no official channel would ever acknowledge. Mr. Whitfield kept 3 of us in the house. We were not allowed to leave. He said if we tried, he would accuse our families of theft or have our fathers lynched. He did whatever he pleased. We were his property in everything but name. The testimony continued. A girl had been there when I arrived, no older than 16. She stayed on the 3rd floor, and we were forbidden to speak to her. At night I heard her crying, and then after a few weeks, she was gone. Mr. Whitfield claimed she had stolen from him and run away. But I knew that wasn't true. She would never have left. She was far too terrified of what he might do to her family. I escaped only because my brother threatened to go to the newspapers. Whitfield released me, rather than risk exposure, but I know others were not as fortunate. Marcus uncovered documents showing Whitfield's deep connections to law enforcement and city officials. He donated regularly to political campaigns and hosted gatherings for Atlanta's elite. He had complete immunity, Marcus said bitterly. The system protected him. The police served him. The courts deferred to him. And black families had no recourse at all. Their daughters could be taken, abused, even killed, and there was nothing they could do. Despite everything they uncovered, Rebecca stayed focused on Louisa herself. The photograph revealed more than victimization, it revealed resistance. The subtle hand signal frozen in that image was an act of defiance, a way to ensure her captivity would not be erased. She knew, Rebecca said quietly. She knew that photograph might be the only evidence she'd ever leave behind. Through Martha Johnson's desperate letters to churches and advocacy groups, they traced the family's attempts to find their daughter. In October 1903, Henry Johnson, still recovering from injuries, tried to force his way into Whitfield's home. He was arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace, spending 2 weeks in jail. The newspapers framed the incident as a respected businessman being harassed by the deranged relative of a disgruntled former employee. Martha later wrote to the newly formed NAACP chapter in Atlanta. My daughter is being held against her will by Charles Whitfield. She went to his home as an employee and is now his prisoner. I have not seen her in 4 months. Please, someone must help us. No one will listen because we are Negro and he is white and wealthy. The NAACP tried to help but ran into the same walls. Their attorney Robert Foster attempted to file a writ of habeas corpus. The judge refused, dismissing the claims as unfounded accusations meant to extort a respectable man. Foster documented the case but could go no further without endangering himself. Then Marcus discovered something unexpected. A letter from December 1903, written by a white woman, Eleanor Hartwell Whitfield's neighbor. She wrote to her sister, "There is something deeply troubling happening next door. Whitfield claims the young Negro woman living there is a servant, but the situation seems far more sinister. I saw her only once, looking out from an upper window. Her face was bruised. I tried to speak with her when Charles was away, but the other servants refused to let me in, clearly frightened. After December 1903, Louisa's trail went cold. Rebecca feared the worst until Marcus found an entry in the Freedmen's Hospital records in Washington, D.C. In March 1904, a young woman named Louisa had been admitted by members of a black mutual aid society who found her near the train station. The notes described a 20-year-old woman with multiple injuries in various stages of healing suffering from extreme trauma, and terrified of men, especially white men. She refused to give her surname and repeatedly said, "He will kill my family if I tell." Social worker Catherine Wells took charge of her case. Her notes painted a horrifying picture: months of captivity, repeated assaults, enforced isolation, and constant threats against her family. In April 1904, Wells recorded Louisa's words, "I was trapped in that house for 8 months. He took everything from me. The photograph he forced me to take in that white dress was the worst day. He wanted people to believe I had chosen to be there. But I left a message in that picture, a distress sign with my fingers. It was the only way I could show the truth." Wells eventually helped Louisa send coded letters to her family. In May 1904, Martha received a message, "Mama, I am alive. I cannot tell you where I am, only that I am safe and healing. He believes I am dead. Please let him continue to believe it. It is the only way to protect all of you." The final piece came from an Atlanta newspaper article in March 1904, reporting a fire at the Whitfield residence. One unidentified servant girl supposedly died in the blaze. Whitfield claimed she had caused the fire through carelessness, but the Atlanta Independent offered a different account. Witnesses had seen a young woman, matching Louisa's description, fleeing the property weeks before. The implication was clear. The body in the fire was not Louisa. She had escaped. The fire appeared to have been deliberately set to conceal Louisa's escape and to intimidate anyone who might dare speak out. The police refused to investigate further. Louisa had gotten away, and Whitfield covered it up by claiming she had died in the blaze. He could not admit she had escaped without exposing the truth of her captivity. To preserve his facade of respectability, he invented her death and moved on. For the Johnson family, this meant they could never publicly acknowledge that their daughter was alive. Doing so would endanger her again. Rebecca and Marcus uncovered years of correspondence between Martha Johnson and Catherine Wells. Catherine had helped Louisa build a new life in Washington, D.C., under an assumed name. Louisa first worked as a seamstress, then trained as a nurse. In 1908, she married a kind man named Edward, a postal worker. They had 4 children together. But Louisa never returned to Atlanta, and her parents were forced to maintain the fiction that their daughter was dead to protect her. Marcus discovered that Louisa had kept her truth alive in her own quiet way. In 1925, she gave testimony to a commission investigating racial violence and exploitation in the South, recounting her ordeal anonymously. Meanwhile, James the photographer had also left behind a crucial piece of the story. His journal described the unsettling day he was forced to take the photograph. She kept looking at me as though trying to tell me something, he wrote. But with Whitfield watching her every move, she couldn't speak. When he noticed her fingers shifting into a deliberate pattern, he realized she was signaling. He captured the gesture clearly across 3 exposures to ensure it wouldn't be lost. "I felt physically ill," he admitted. "I knew I wasn't photographing a wedding. I was witnessing something criminal, but reporting it to the police would have been useless." Whitfield was untouchable. Marcus broadened the investigation and discovered that Whitfield's abuse extended far beyond Louisa. Court filings, property documents, and newspaper clippings revealed a chilling pattern. Between 1899 and 1905, at least 6 families reported daughters who had gone to work for Whitfield and then disappeared. The pattern was always the same: a struggling black family. A daughter 16 to 20 hired as domestic help. Letters home at first, then silence. Family members turned away when attempting to visit. Police reports immediately dismissed. 2 of the young women eventually resurfaced months later, broken silent, refusing to speak of what had happened. Rebecca found the testimony of a woman named Sarah who worked for Whitfield in 1901. Her statement had been recorded by a black community organization because official institutions refused to hear complaints against powerful white men. "He kept 3 of us in that house," Sarah said. "We were never allowed to leave. He said if we tried, he would have our families arrested or our fathers lynched. He did whatever he wanted to us. We were his property in everything but name. Her account matched the testimony of another girl, the 16-year-old on the third floor, whom she had heard crying at night. Sarah knew the girl hadn't run away despite Whitfield's claim. She wouldn't have left, she said. She was too afraid of what he would do to her family. Sarah escaped only because her brother threatened to alert the newspapers. Whitfield released her to avoid scrutiny. Many others, she believed, were not so lucky. Marcus found proof of Whitfield's protection. His donations to political campaigns, his close ties to police officers, judges, and city officials, and the lavish social gatherings he hosted for Atlanta's elite. He had complete immunity, Marcus said. The system protected him. The police worked for him. The courts deferred to him. Black families had no recourse at all. Despite the depths of this darkness, Rebecca kept her focus on Louisa. The photograph told a story not just of suffering, but of resistance. The hand signal frozen in that portrait was an act of defiance, a silent refusal to let her imprisonment vanish without evidence. She knew, Rebecca whispered, studying the image. She knew this photograph might be the only proof she ever left behind. Tracing Martha Johnson's letters, Rebecca and Marcus followed the family's desperate attempts to find their daughter. Henry Johnson, still injured, had tried forcing his way into Whitfield's home in October 1903. He was arrested and smeared in the press as a deranged relative harassing a respectable businessman. Martha's letter to the newly formed NAACP chapter in Atlanta pleaded for help. My daughter is being held against her will. We have exhausted every legal avenue. No one will listen because we are Negro and he is white and wealthy. The NAACP tried, but their lawyer Robert Foster was blocked at every turn. A judge refused to issue a writ of habeas corpus accusing the family of attempting to extort Whitfield. Then came the unexpected, a letter from Whitfield's white neighbor, Eleanor Hartwell, who had seen Louisa bruised and trapped in the house. She wanted to report it, but feared no one would believe her. The trail went cold until the Freedmen's Hospital records surfaced. In March 1904, a young woman named Louisa was admitted with severe injuries. She refused her last name, trembled in the presence of men, and begged not to reveal where she had come from, saying, "He will kill my family if I tell." Catherine Wells's notes detailed months of torture. Louisa eventually revealed, "I was trapped in that house for 8 months. He took everything, my freedom, my dignity, my connection to my family." But she also explained the photograph. "He forced me into that white dress, tried to pretend I was his wife. But I made sure to leave a message. I positioned my fingers just so a distress signal I had read about. I didn't know if anyone would ever notice, but I had to try. The photograph he forced me to take, the one with the white dress, was the worst day of my life." Her voice, soft and trembling in the old notes, felt like it was still echoing through time. He wanted to pretend I was his wife, to pretend I had chosen to be there. But I made sure to leave a message in that picture. She wrote of moving her fingers just slightly into a shape she had once read about a hidden distress signal disguised as nothing. She didn't know whether anyone would ever notice. She only knew she had to try. She needed someone someday to understand she had not gone willingly. The records showed that Catherine had helped Louisa send carefully coded letters to her family, letters so subtle that Whitfield would never suspect. In May 1904, Martha received one. "Mama, I am alive. I cannot tell you where I am, only that I am safe and healing. the man who held me, believes I am dead, please let him continue to believe that. It is the only way to protect all of you. I will write again when I can. I love you, your daughter. Marcus uncovered the final piece months later, hidden in Atlanta's 1904 archives. A small newspaper clipping, almost forgettable, reported a fire at the Whitfield residence. One servant, unnamed, supposedly died. Whitfield claimed she had been careless with a cooking fire, the body burned, beyond recognition. A tragic accident, they wrote. But the Atlanta Independent, speaking in careful, guarded phrases, told a different story. Neighbors had seen a young woman escape weeks earlier. Witnesses whispered that she fled in February, long before the fire. The fire, they suggested, was no accident. It was a cover, a warning, a way to erase the truth before anyone asked questions. Police declined to investigate. Louisa had escaped. Whitfield had simply rewritten reality. He could not admit she had gotten away doing so, would expose the crime he had buried under wealth, race, and reputation. So, he created her fictional death and moved on. For her family, this meant silence. Permanent silence. They could never publicly acknowledge she was alive. Doing so would endanger her all over again. Rebecca and Marcus traced years of letters between Martha Johnson and Catherine Wells. Through them, Louisa slowly rebuilt a life in Washington, D.C. under a new name. She worked first as a seamstress, then trained as a nurse. In 1908, she married a gentleman named Edward, a postal worker. They raised 4 children together, but Louisa never returned to Atlanta. And her parents were forced to mourn her publicly while loving her privately. Later, Marcus discovered that Louisa kept her story alive in her own quiet way. In 1925, she gave anonymous testimony before a commission investigating racial violence in the South. I was 19, she said, when a white man took me from my family and held me for 8 months. He could do this because the law did not protect girls like me. He knew no one would believe my words. He knew my family had no power. But I survived, and I want this recorded so that when the world is ready, they will know what happened to women like me. Rebecca and Marcus spent 6 months compiling everything, every trace, every letter, every painful fragment into a full historical record. Their work led them to Washington, D.C., where they found Louisa's great-great-granddaughter, Dr. Michelle Foster, a historian at Howard University. When Rebecca called, the response was immediate and full of emotion. We have been waiting for someone to find this story. They met at Michelle's home where Louisa's belongings were carefully preserved. My great-great-grandmother lived until 1978, Michelle said softly. She was 94, and she never forgot Atlanta. She told us her story only when we were old enough to carry it. She made us promise to protect it. She said, someday, someone will find that photograph. And when they do, I want them to know the whole truth. Michelle showed them a journal Louisa kept in her later years. One entry read, I lived a good life despite what was done to me. I raised 4 children. I brought babies into the world as a nurse. I loved and I was loved. But I never forgot those 8 months. I never forgot my parents' anguish. Somewhere that photograph still exists, holding my silent scream. I pray someone will one day see it and understand. When the National Museum of African American History and Culture opened their exhibition, Silent Testimony: Louisa's Story and the Hidden History of Jim Crow. Captivity. That photograph became its center. Displayed beside it were the photographer's journal. The hospital notes, the family letters, and Louisa's own testimony. The exhibition text was honest, even haunting. This photograph does not document a wedding. It documents a crime. It revealed the truth: a young black woman held captive by a white man who faced no consequences because the laws of Jim Crow America protected him completely. At the opening, Michelle stood before the image with tears streaming. Beside the 1903 portrait was a photo of Louisa in 1960, aged 76, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Her face calm, her eyes unbroken. "My great-great-grandmother survived," Michelle said. She didn't just survive, she transcended. She turned her pain into purpose. This photograph is no longer just about captivity. It is about resistance, courage, a refusal to be erased. Rebecca addressed the audience next. For 120 years, Louisa's signal went unseen, but she left it anyway. She trusted that someday, someone would look closely enough. As thousands passed through the exhibition in the months that followed, they paused before Louisa's hand signal, her hidden plea, her trace of truth. And at last, more than a century later, her voice was heard. The photograph had finally fulfilled its purpose, not as evidence that could save Louisa in her own lifetime, but as a quiet testament that refused to let her story drift into oblivion. At last, her silent scream, preserved in the stillness of that image, had been heard. And in being heard, it awakened the voices of countless others whose stories had long been buried beneath history's deliberate amnesia. Years before that moment, Louisa had chosen to speak even when she could not reveal her true name. She had sat before a commission investigating racial violence in the South and offered a fragment of herself, a truth softened only by the need for safety. "I was 19 when a white man took me from my family," she told them, her voice steady, "and held me captive for 8 months. He could do this because the law offered no protection to people who looked like me. He knew no one would believe my words. He knew my family held no power to bring me home. But I survived. And I want my story on record so that when the world is finally ready to listen, someone will understand what happened to women like me." Those words would lie dormant for decades, waiting as though they sensed that the world would not be ready for a very long time. Rebecca and Marcus spent 6 patient months threading these fragments together, shaping them into a complete historical record. Their research finally led them to Washington, D.C., where they found Louisa's descendant, a woman named Dr. Michelle Foster, a scholar of African American history at Howard University. When Rebecca reached out, Michelle's response came quickly, wrapped in emotion. "We have been waiting for someone to find this story," she said. They met at Michelle's home, where she had carefully preserved everything Louisa had left behind. "My great-grandmother lived until 1978, Michelle explained softly. She was 94 years old, and she never forgot what happened in Atlanta. When we were old enough, she entrusted us with the truth. She made us swear to keep it alive, to protect it from being erased. One day, she told us, someone will find that photograph, and when they do, I want them to know the whole truth." Michelle guided them to Louisa's journals, pages worn with time yet deeply alive. One entry read, I have lived a good life despite what was done to me. I raised 4 beautiful children. I helped bring dozens of babies into the world as a nurse. I loved and I was loved. But I never forgot those 8 months. And I never forgot my parents' anguish. The photograph exists somewhere with my silent scream frozen inside it. I pray that one day someone will see it and understand. I pray my story will help people recognize how many women suffered in silence, trapped by laws that denied our humanity in a society that refused to see our pain. It was this legacy that inspired the National Museum of African American History and Culture to create an exhibition titled Silent Testimony: Louisa's Story and the Hidden History of Jim Crow Captivity. At its center stood the 1903 photograph, unassuming at first glance, but surrounded by layers of truth: the photographer's journal, hospital records, family letters, and Louisa's own testimony. The museum's description made no attempt to soften the truth. This photograph documents not a marriage, but a crime. It shows a young black woman held captive by a white man who faced no consequences, shielded by the laws and social structures of Jim Crow America that granted him absolute impunity. On opening night, Michelle stood before the photograph, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Beside the 1903 image hung another picture. Louisa in 1960, age 76, seated among her children and grandchildren. Her face calm, her posture steady, her life full. My great-grandmother survived, Michelle told the gathered crowd. But more than that, she transcended. She turned her trauma into purpose. She raised a family, healed others, and built a life filled with meaning. This photograph no longer represents only her captivity. It represents her resistance, her courage, and her refusal to be erased. Rebecca then stepped forward, addressing the audience with a solemn gentleness. For 120 years, Louisa's distress signal went unnoticed. But she left it there anyway, trusting that someone someday would look closely enough to see. Her story is not just about one woman's suffering. It is about the systematic abuse made possible by racist laws and social structures. It is about the countless black women who endured similar horrors with no recourse. And it is about the extraordinary resilience of those who lived on creating lives of dignity in a world built to deny them humanity. In the months that followed, thousands of visitors walked through the exhibition. They paused before the photograph, studying the slight curl of Louisa's fingers. They read her words. They felt the weight of history settle around them, quiet but undeniable. And in those moments, the photograph completed the task Louisa had hoped for when she first raised her hand in that desperate signal. It did not save her then, but it carried her voice across time. It refused to let silence win. Her silent scream had finally found a listener. And in being heard, it awakened the forgotten voices of many others' voices history had tried so deeply, so deliberately to erase.